Right now, on rooftops all over the world, sunlight is quietly being turned into electricity. It powers homes, satellites, calculators, even entire power grids. Solar energy feels like one of the most futuristic technologies we have, but here's the twist. The science behind it is actually 185 years old, and for more than a century, almost nobody believed it would ever be useful for anything. This is the story of a 19-year-old French teenager who stumbled onto something extraordinary by accident, a New York inventor who was decades ahead of his time and completely ignored for it, and a Cold War satellite that finally proved sunlight could power more than a toy. So let's go all the way back to where solar power truly began, because the story is far stranger than someone invented solar panels. Our story starts in 1839 in a laboratory in Paris, and the person responsible for one of history's most important energy discoveries wasn't even old enough to legally drink by today's standards. His name was Edmond Becquerel, and he was just 19 years old, working in his father's lab at the National Museum of Natural History. Becquerel wasn't trying to invent solar power. He was experimenting with electrolytic cells, basically. Two metal electrodes dropped into an acidic liquid, but when he shone light onto one of those electrodes, something unexpected happened. A small voltage appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He had just discovered what we now call the photovoltaic effect, the ability of certain materials to generate electricity when exposed to light. It would eventually be renamed the Becquerel effect in his honor, and it remains the exact scientific principle every single solar panel on Earth still relies on today. Here's the wild part, though. Becquerel had no idea what he'd actually found. He couldn't explain why it happened, and there was no practical use for it at the time. He simply published his findings and moved on to other research, including work on fluorescence and phosphorescence. In fact, decades later, his own son, Henri Becquerel, would go on to win a Nobel Prize for discovering radioactivity. Discovery, it seems, ran in the family. But solar energy as we know it wouldn't take a real step forward for another 44 years, and when it did, almost nobody noticed. In 1883, a New York inventor named Charles Fritz took Becquerel's strange discovery and turned it into an actual working device. Fritz coated a thin sheet of selenium with an ultra-thin, almost transparent layer of gold, and when sunlight hit it, the device produced a current that was continuous, constant, and surprisingly forceful. This was, quite literally, the world's first solar cell. And the following year, Fritz reportedly went even further, installing an array of these cells on a New York City rooftop, one of the earliest attempts anywhere in the world to generate electricity directly from sunlight on a building. So why haven't more people heard of Charles Fritz? Because his invention, frankly, was terrible by any practical standard. His solar cells converted only about 1 to 2% of sunlight into usable electricity. Compare that to modern solar panels, which typically convert 15 to 20%. Selenium was also expensive and difficult to work with. At a time when Thomas Edison was busy building the first fossil fuel power plants, nobody had any real incentive to bet on a wildly inefficient alternative made of rare, costly material. So Fritz's solar cell became a scientific curiosity, a proof of concept that was, quite simply, born about 70 years too early. It would take a completely different material and a completely different laboratory to turn solar power into something the world could actually use. Fast forward to the early 1950s at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. A team of researchers, Darrell Chapin, Calvin Fuller, and Gerald Pearson, weren't even trying to build a solar cell. They were actually working on something completely different. Silicon transistors, the building blocks of modern electronics. While experimenting with gallium-doped silicon treated in a lithium bath, the team stumbled onto something remarkable. They had accidentally created a far more effective solar cell than anyone had ever built before. On April 25, 1954, Bell Labs formally unveiled what they called the solar battery, a silicon-based solar cell with roughly 6% efficiency. That might not sound impressive today, but it was a massive leap over Fritz's selenium cell from 70 years earlier. To demonstrate it, Bell Labs engineers used their new invention to power a small toy Ferris wheel and a solar-powered radio transmitter in front of journalists. The reaction was enormous. The New York Times ran a story declaring that this breakthrough could mark the beginning of a new era, one where humanity might finally harness the almost limitless energy of the sun. But there was still a problem. Silicon solar cells were extremely expensive to produce, which meant that, for most ordinary people and businesses, they simply weren't practical. Solar power needed one very specific kind of customer, one who had virtually no other options and virtually no budget constraints. And in 1958, it found exactly that customer, the United States government. By the late 1950s, America was locked in the space race with the Soviet Union, racing to launch the first successful satellites into orbit. And satellites had a very specific, very stubborn problem. They needed a reliable, long-lasting source of power in a place where nobody could ever change the batteries. Solar cells turned out to be the perfect solution. In March of 1958, the United States launched Vanguard 1, a satellite roughly the size of a grapefruit, equipped with 6 small silicon solar cells to back up its batteries. It worked spectacularly well. While Vanguard 1's radio transmitter eventually ran for years, thanks largely to its solar power system, the earlier satellites launched with only battery power had gone dead within weeks. Solar power had finally proven itself where it mattered most, not on a rooftop in New York, but in the vacuum of space, where failure wasn't an option. From that point forward, virtually every satellite launched into orbit would rely on solar panels for power, a practice that continues to this very day. But back on Earth, solar power was still seen as a niche, expensive technology, until an entirely different kind of crisis forced the world to take it seriously. In the early 1970s, the world was hit by a severe energy crisis. Oil prices skyrocketed, fuel shortages spread panic across gas stations, and for the first time, many countries, especially the United States, were forced to seriously question their total dependence on fossil fuels. Suddenly, a strange, expensive technology that had mostly been used for satellites started to look a lot more interesting. Governments and universities began pouring research funding into solar energy. In 1973, the University of Delaware even built one of the world's first solar-powered buildings, nicknamed Solar One, combining both solar heating and early photovoltaic technology. Progress, however, was still painfully slow. It would take decades of refinement, falling silicon costs, and eventually government incentives like tax credits to finally make solar power something an average homeowner could realistically afford. But once that shift happened, it happened fast. Solar installation costs plunged, efficiency climbed well past 20%. And what was once a curiosity for space engineers became one of the fastest-growing sources of electricity on the entire planet.